All right, thanks for joining everybody. What we're going to do today, we're kind of doing two separate things all in one. First is we're going to talk some about just the why behind why we do things the way that we do things. And the reason for that, I know that'll be old news for a lot of you, but we are going to go over it because we're also going to be tweaking some of our systems, putting in just a little bit more structure in place on certain things. So I want you to have the why in mind. And also because, we're still relatively new, even though the restructure took us a year, we're still relatively new into the restructure. And so I want to make sure that we're all on our own teams, but on the same page and doing things the same way across sites. So that's the focus of today. So it is mostly going to be me talking, so feel free to stop me if you have questions, if you have concerns as we go along. I'll ask for feedback at different points, but feel free to stop me as we go. So let's start with the philosophy of how we do things the way that we do. And what I wanted to just start with is it's part of what is prompting this conversation is it's been kind of a tough season, I think. We've had some conflicts in the house, some crazy conflicts at times, but also I think getting all of us on one system across having 4 sites, I know that I've at least felt even the day-to-day grind of just making sure that all the million little things that is required to house this many people. Sometimes that also feels overwhelming. And sometimes that actually makes me feel burnt out faster, is dealing with the constantness of like, this kitchen needs to be clean. We need to make sure there's food, like that level of stuff constantly. And so what the way that I want us to think about things so that we're preventing burnout, so that we have good relationships with the clients, and so that we're keeping the end goal in mind. These are kind of the things that I've been thinking about. So first is when we're addressing, especially those day-to-day things, sometimes I think that's harder. The big things, the big safety things, there's often just one solution to that. So we don't have to like debate it most of the time. If there's something crazy that happens, a lot of times that family's getting moved or they're getting exited or something of that level is happening. But sometimes the day-to-day stuff is harder. And so when we're addressing those things, these are the things that I want us to keep in mind. First, our don'ts. So I don't want us to come into things addressing those things with a punitive mindset. So our goal shouldn't be to punish. The word punish, even to me, that tells me if we're thinking about it in terms of punishment, that tells me that we're thinking about it as if we're the parent and we're trying to get obedience out of this person that we're working with. Even like maybe not intentionally, but that's part of our mindset about it. And so that's not what we want. These are adults. We want to treat them as adults. We don't want, the goal is not to punish them or to get them to obey even. The goal is for them to ultimately end up housed, right? And so in how we address it, what we should be thinking about is how can I address this issue while still maintaining a positive relationship with this family? And how can I make sure that I'm addressing it fairly? So that's the first thing. The second thing is we don't want to take things personally. And I know that also can be challenging because we deal with some challenging personalities sometimes. But what I find for myself is if I catch myself feeling resentful or I have like some bitterness about a certain family, sometimes that means I need to check myself and make sure that I'm not addressing a certain issue out of feeling like I've been wronged. We have to make sure that we have the right motives when we're going to address a problem. And that also we keep in mind that most of what a family's doing actually has very little to do with us. I know sometimes I feel like, especially when I'm overwhelmed, I get a feeling of like, this thing that you're doing is making my life harder. And so that can feel like, why are you doing this to me? But it's actually not about us, if they clean the bathroom or not, or if even it's something more extreme, if they're, using substances on site or whatever, something of that level, even that has nothing to do with me, actually, even though it sometimes feels like, why are you doing this to me? And I wish I didn't have to address it. Right. So those are the things we want to keep in mind. instead of those things, we do want our response to be characterized by a couple different things. So one is we want our response to be proportionate. So small mistakes should have small consequences, big mistakes should have big consequences. So if it's something big like a safety violation, we're not probably even going to spend the time talking about it. They're going to be exited, right? If they bring a visitor on site, if they sneak their ex in, that's not a thing that we're even going to debate. That gets a big consequence. But again, this is an issue where I think sometimes the day-to-day stuff can be harder because, okay, what's a small consequence for someone missing their chore that feels proportionate, but is still addressing the issue? And so what we're going to talk about is wanting to, as much as possible, think about natural consequences. And we'll go into that more later. Also, the other thing I want us to do is to really over communicate. And I know that sometimes this will feel silly, or it'll feel like we're extending too much grace or something like that. And I want us to err on the side of too much grace and too much over communication, partially because we know that scientifically trauma really significantly impacts the brain, and people who are dealing with a lot of trauma have a harder time hearing the information that we're giving them and also retaining the information that we give them. So it's part of our job to make sure we're saying it multiple times, that we say it. That's part of why I say it in the interviews twice. They hear it from the case manager. But when you're addressing a certain issue, I want us to talk about that same issue with them multiple times before we take a next step, so that there's no surprises at any point, and we can document and say, we've had this conversation multiple times, and because you haven't listened, now we have to move to the next step. So we also want to warn them what that next step is going to be and make sure that we're doing a good job communicating that. So these are our do's and don'ts. Any questions about any of that or any feedback on those things? You know, this should be review pretty much, but okay. The last thing, just in terms of philosophy, that I want to end with is I think another thing I struggle with sometimes is keeping the end goal in mind, because there's so many details and it takes a huge group of people, you know, all of us on this call, plus a bunch of people who can't be here, to make the houses run and to serve as many families as we're serving. It's a huge effort. And so if I get too bogged down in those details, I can lose sight of the fact that ultimately the ultimate thing we're trying to do is get these families housed. So if a family is, you know, not progressing in a certain way, not showing the progress that we want, we have to also know, okay, that might be true. Let's hold this in one hand. Let's also hold in the other hand that we're trying to get them housed. How can we help them bridge that divide as much as possible? The goal is not, for example, trying to make sure that they do everything 100% right 100% of the time, because that's never going to happen. And all that we're going to do is frustrate ourselves trying to get that to happen. And also, we're going to exit every single family that comes in here, because there's just no way for every person to do every single thing all the time. The amount of times I haven't done my chore, or I have dishes in my sink at my house, you know, it's just human nature. And so we're not looking for perfection. We need to, every time we find that thought kind of coming up in our heads, we need to kill that thought and just remember that we're looking for progress. Even if it's small progress, we're looking for progress and we're not looking for perfection, all in pursuit of this family getting housed. So how can we do everything that we can to make sure they get housed? And secondly, then in pursuit of that, the other goal is to make sure the houses are safe and they're operating smoothly, and that we're minimizing conflict wherever possible. So similar, you might see a family doing something that you know that they shouldn't be doing, or maybe I won't say it that way. Maybe you might see a family doing something that you don't agree with, you know, or like they're making a parenting choice that you don't agree with, or they're doing their like they're setting a schedule that you don't agree with, or something like that. You can see, okay, I see a way that you can do this better, that your life could be easier. You know, we can have those thoughts, and there's ways to address those things. But you have to ask yourself also, okay, sometimes those things are outside of our realm, and trying to control those things too much will cause us to have more problems than we actually would have without doing that, you know? So if we're saying to ourselves, let's assess for, is this a safety issue? Is this something that I need to address in order to make sure the house is safe and operating? Or is this maybe something I just don't agree with and I can come at it from a different angle with this family? Because the goal is not to make sure that everything is enforced 100% of the time. So those are our goals. We want to ask ourselves, is whatever I'm doing in pursuit of those goals? Is the way that I'm addressing it in pursuit of those goals? Or are we also sometimes addressing it out of frustration or trying to get back at a family, even subconsciously? I'm sure that no one will do that intentionally, but we got to just be really conscious about checking our motives, because it's easy to become frustrated. It can be a frustrating job. So we have to really be on top of our own internal metrics on those things. So that's the goal. Any questions on that before we move away from philosophy? Okay. So one of the things that we're tweaking a little bit, or just putting making it more tangible, I guess, is how these are the steps that we want you guys to take when you're addressing some of these day-to-day issues. Like I said, the big safety issues or the case plan type of things kind of have a different system because they tend to be pretty black and white. The things that are a little more like, okay, how should we go about this, are sort of these more day-to-day things. So what I'm thinking about when we're talking about these issues are things like chores, life skills classes, making sure that they're coming to their appointments, like case management and therapy, making sure that they're doing their cooking, like things on this level that are just the day-to-day. Are they meeting the program requirements that we're asking them to meet? So if you have a family that is not meeting those things, and it's in your bucket, which we'll talk about, these are the steps we'd like you guys to take. So first is for you to talk to them about it, coming at it from the point of view of how can we problem solve this, right? So that first conversation, we don't want it to be accusatory or like you don't need to come in too hot. We just want you to approach them as, how can we solve this? This is a thing I noticed. How can we solve this? And also asking them if they need any support in making this thing happen. So in case management, that might be, okay, you missed this case management. What's going on? Do we need a different time? Do we, come at it from that point of view? With chores or cooking, it might be like, okay, you missed this. Do you need some help with figuring out what to cook? Do you need some help with figuring out where the supplies are? Approach it from that point of view first. This level of conversation that's just kind of exploratory, problem solving, we want you to have that conversation more than once. So we know that that's giving them the benefit of the doubt, but that's on purpose. We're doing that on purpose. So please have this level of conversation more than once before you move to the next stage. After you've had that conversation with them more than once, the next stage is about that over communication. We want you to then say, okay, you and I have talked about this a couple times. Here's what's going to happen if this problem continues to persist. So you'll give them forewarning about what the next step is going to be, whatever the consequence is. So that's number 2. Number 3 is the consequence itself. So for vast majority of things, whenever possible, we want you guys to think up what a natural consequence should be. So for something on this level, we don't want it yet to become write-ups and exits. We want it to be, what's a natural consequence that you can give them? So some examples, I know in the past we've done someone consistently using someone else's laundry time. The natural consequence is they have to use the laundromat. They can't use our on-site facility anymore. Or someone who's not moving their car at LR when they need to be. Natural consequence is you don't get to park here anymore, right? So there's a whole host of these. There's a bunch of examples. The other thing I'll highlight is something like the example for life skills. We now have, this raffle that we're going to be doing in house meeting. So Hannah and Luis will be in charge of going through each month, seeing who's been participating in programming across the board, who's eligible to be put into a raffle for a gift card. So something like life skills, that might be another just tool that you can use to say, okay, you're not going to be in the raffle if you continue not to come to this. There might be other consequences too, but that's just something else that you can use as you go through, right? So anytime that you can come up with a natural consequence and not go directly to write-ups, we want you to do that. If that, those are the first 3 steps. What we hope is that majority of issues, that solves it. Most people, most of the time, they're trying to do the right thing, and there's a reason. If they can't do it, there's a reason, right? So maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they got too much going on. We hope that being able to approach the conversation with them this way, be upfront with them about what's going to happen, but treat them with respect and saying, we know that you guys have stuff going on, having that kind of in the caveat of the conversation, we hope that that will mean that you can address those things without it becoming a repeated issue, right? Or without it escalating any further. If, however, you find that, okay, we've had these conversations and I've set a natural consequence and the problem is continuing, then we'd like you to kick it to your supervisor. So Tatiana and Tanya will be able to brainstorm with you, and it might be at that point, more than likely, that might mean write-up, because we've given them lots of chances and we've given them a natural consequence. Might be time for a write-up. So Tatiana and Tanya, if they hear from anybody on their team, okay, this person, this is what we've tried, we think write-up is the next stage, they'll come and talk to me about it, and then we'll institute either write-ups or exits or whatever, depending on what's going on. So that's kind of the next step. We want to, this final point, number 5, is all about communicating how we want to communicate as a team. So if you've kicked it up to the it might be that someone else needs to know, that person is going to be your supervisor. Probably nobody else on the team needs to know. So if you address a chore issue, if you address a case issue in case management, and you squash it, great. Thank you for squashing it, because that means it's not on somebody else's plate, right? And probably nobody else needs to know about that. If it's a repeated issue and you got to tell somebody, that person will be your supervisor. Probably that's as far as that communication is going to go. If, however, there are some exceptions. So if it's a safety issue, like I know we've had quite a few of those recently where I'll use Cecilia's recent case as an example. Hannah told other people about that, right? Which is exactly what she should have done. So thanks for doing that, Hannah. That's a safety concern. That's a super serious issue. People need to know that that's happening in the house. Same thing if it involves a house dynamics issue. So let's say 2 families are fighting. Maybe they're not physically fighting. Maybe you're not worried about a safety issue. It's still helpful for staff to know these 2 families are in conflict and things might flare up. So keep an eye out, right? Something of that level. Things like that are things that it'll be helpful for the rest of the team to know. Things that are not helpful for the rest of the team to know, or maybe not helpful, but sometimes just too much information, is like every time somebody misses a life skills, every time someone misses a chore, anything like that, or for case managers, every time they miss a case management meeting, or they're not making progress on a budget or what have you. The rest of the team, that's too much information for us, because what will end up happening is we have 1,000 emails in the inbox and I'm reading them all at a level 10 and everyone's feeling overwhelmed because there's so many things to respond to. That's too much information. What I want us to do is, when you're on shift, you're solving that problem. If you can't solve that problem, it's getting kicked up to your supervisor. The rest of the team is on need to know. And that way it protects everybody else's peace of mind, everybody else's bandwidth, because otherwise what I fear is that every person on this call is going to get burnt out because they're saying, I'm too aware of the problems on my plate and Hannah's plate and Aaron's plate and Mariana's plate. I don't need to know about every single person's plate, right? You only need to know about your plate and whatever your supervisor, or is super relevant for you. So that's the goal. And the other thing about this is, part of the other reason that we're kind of tweaking this is we trust you guys. We know that part of why you're here, part of the reason that you've been hired, is because we trust you to see a problem and solve it, right? We're all empowered as staff to solve the problem. It doesn't have to get kicked up to your supervisor. They don't have the extra authority, right? Everybody's got authority to solve problems. And so everyone should be respected equally as staff, and staff should be respecting equally the residents. And so if that dynamic is happening, then you can definitely call on people when you need the support, but don't feel like you need the permission. That's kind of the difference. So it's all that makes sense. I see Miss Wendy's hand raised. Question, Miss Wendy?
So my question is, when you do the shift handoff, if you're not telling your colleague what you experienced or what happened, and I mean, your plan is that you're going to resolve it. How does the shift handoff happen? Do you just not mention that you had that problem with the resident, or how does that work?
Yeah, good question. Usually there shouldn't be a shift handoff. 90% of the time, if the shift went well, you don't need to do a shift handoff. If there's something pressing, so either there's a safety issue, there's an issue of fighting in the house, something of that level. If there's something of a certain level of seriousness, anything you have to write a special incident report about, anything like that, then you will tell the next person who's coming in. And we'll go into when to tell your supervisor certain things too. So we'll talk about that some more. The exception to this is for our weekend staff, both a handoff for the person coming in on Friday and then the person who's leaving on Sunday. So the reason for that is because that's an extended period of time in which the weekend staff are the only one on shift. So you guys have kind of a unique role, and we don't want you to come in blind. And we also appreciate knowing what happened. And so weekend managers, the things, what you're sending is great in terms of your weekend reports. We want to know, the highlights, the big things that happened, and anything that you need day staff to follow up on, because the other thing that's unique about weekend staff is they are the only one on shift when they're on shift. So it might be that you need some backup, and that's something that like the day staff can help with. But if you're able to, what we want you to do is, even for weekend staff, someone didn't do their chore, solve that. You don't need to have the day staff come back in and solve that, right? Unless you've talked about it multiple times, it's a pattern, we've already talked to your supervisor, you've taken all those steps. In that case, yes, please do tell the day staff. But like that's the steps that we want you guys to follow. Does that answer your question, Ms. Wendy? Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions or concerns about anything so far? Okay. So to answer the second part of Ms. Wendy's question, when should you be calling somebody in? Like, this is an emergency situation and I need some help. So there are definitely times, and more lately, it seems like, where we've had some real emergencies on site. And that is absolutely a time where you may need to call somebody. What I would like you guys to keep in mind as far as calling in emergencies goes are these three things. And this is specifically for times when you are the only one on shift. So that could be weekend staff. It could also be maybe you're covering night shift, right? So it's 5 to 10 and your supervisor's already gone home. You're the only one there. Any of those kinds of times when you're making a decision about whether to, the crux of this is, are you making a decision about whether or not to call someone who's not at work, right? Because if your supervisor's on shift and you need whatever, feel free to call that person. But when you're making a decision about whether or not to call somebody who's already gone home for the day. So these are the things I want you guys to keep in mind in that case. First is the issue that you're calling about an emergency? So is it a safety issue? Someone's actively in danger, right? If it is, it's absolutely an emergency, and we'll move on to the next step. If it's not an active safety issue, even if it's serious, but it's not an active safety issue, think about whether or not this can be something that can wait till the next day when your supervisor's there, or if it can happen, if you can just, it's like a thing they need to know about, but maybe they don't need to know about it right now. Send them an email about it and they can see it when they come into work the next day. The reason is we're trying to protect everybody's time when they're not on shift, right? Especially with these new schedules, people are working 10-hour days. That's a long day to then come home and answer an emergency call that's not truly an emergency. If it is, again, don't ever feel like you can't call. If it's an emergency, please feel free to call. That's what the supervisors are here for. But just be thoughtful about that. Second thing is, okay, it is an emergency, and you're making a decision about whether or not to call. Think about what is it that you're asking for your supervisor to do. So is it something like, I don't know how to handle this situation? If that's the case, perfectly valid reason to call. Please do call your supervisor. Is it something like, this is really heavy and I need to be able to talk it out with somebody, you know, and I'm feeling overwhelmed. I need the emotional support. Another perfectly valid reason to call your supervisor. That is what the supervisor is for. If, though, it's something like, for example, this resident is telling me something that's really heavy, it might not feel totally emergency, but it's really serious. But if it's something that your supervisor also can't fix, then don't call the supervisor. If it's something like, okay, the supervisor can come and help me with this tomorrow, this is going to keep until tomorrow, please don't call the supervisor, right? Unless you need the help. If you need the help, fine. But if the situation is like, man, someone just told me something that's really intense, but I can't fix it, the supervisor can't fix it, you know, this person has a DCFS case, none of us can do anything about that, right? And it's 9:30 at night. In that kind of a situation, if you have a handle on it, please don't call the supervisor. And the third thing similar to this is the person that you should be calling. The reason I keep saying supervisor is that's who you should be calling. If you are the only person on shift and you have some issue arise, please don't call your coworker unless they're also at work. If they're at work, that's between y'all. But if they're not at work, don't call them, because that person is not paid to answer late night calls, right? They're not paid enough to deal with that. The supervisor, that is what the supervisor is for, to be on call for those emergencies. So if you do need to make a call, please call the supervisor and not your coworker. The reason for all of this is, I hope this doesn't feel like overly harsh or something like that. What the reason is, we're trying to prevent burnout, right? And having this feeling of, man, I could be called at any time. I'm constantly on shift. There's never a time where I'm not at work. That wears on people over time, right? And so I want to, for the supervisors, I want to try to protect their time. If you don't need to call them, if it's not something they can fix, please don't. But for everybody else too, you shouldn't be fielding those calls from your coworkers if you're not supervising them. You know, if they're calling you a lot after hours, please feel free to direct them back to their supervisor, because that's what the supervisor's for. So for all of us, these are heavy jobs and they've been intense lately. I want you guys to protect yourselves and protect your coworkers as much as possible. At the same time, feel like that is what the supervisor is here to support you in. Tati, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else has this question, but in case you do, I will ask it. When we're needing to call our supervisor, since we all work such like weird schedules or different schedules, should we be calling their calling or texting their personal phone in case their work phone is not on them because they're off shift? That way we make sure that the supervisor does get the call and they don't get it the next day when it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will let you and Tanya talk in with your teams if you want something different than this. But to me, the default is for the staff to call the personal phone. And the reason for that is because I would also like everybody to be practicing good boundaries and turning your work phone off when you're not at work. And I mean, like, fully turning it off. It shouldn't, don't have a ringer on and accidentally see it the next day. I know I have done that and I have lived to regret it. So please, either keep your work phone at work if you don't need it. Turn it completely off. And the reason that we give out the personal phone is so that you're still available, but you're not seeing every little thing that comes in when you're not on shift. So Tatiana and Tanya, if you guys want something, a different system than that, I mean, whatever works for you, you can feel free to share that with your teams. But generally speaking, that's the thing that has made the most sense for me.
Me too. Personal phone works for me.
Cool. Any questions about this emergency procedure stuff? Okay, I'll just mention too, the scheduling's been a little, we're adjusting to new scheduling. And so one thing I'll just note so that you guys know, Tatiana and Tanya are meant to be fully out on Fridays. So if they're receiving calls on a Friday, it should be because it's an emergency. And in those cases, your first line of defense can actually be me, because I'm mostly out on Fridays, but I'm working an hour or two most Fridays. So you can call me first and I'll try to deal with it myself, or provide whatever support is needed. And then if you can't get a hold of me, because that will be a situation where I probably won't have my work phone on, you'll have to call my personal. If you can't get a hold of me, Regina is also in the office on Friday. So the two of us should be able to handle 95% of things on Fridays. And if we can't, we'll bring in Tatiana or Tanya. So that's the emergency procedure stuff. I'm going to switch now to our last thing, which is just clarifying what is in everybody's bucket. So this is also same thing, old news, I think, for everybody, but I just wanted to name and acknowledge that there's some things that certain people are handling and there's some things that everybody is handling, right? So, and this is not a complete list, ran out of room on the sheet, but just to give you a general sense, the way we're thinking about it is case manager team is the like day-to-day of the case plan, right? The family's like progress towards housing. All of Tanya's team, program assistants, night and weekend staff, the coverage staff who aren't even on here. All of those people are our operations side, right? So they're helping us make sure the lights stay on and everything runs smooth. And so both huge responsibilities. Both of those things are really big buckets. So there's plenty to do for everybody. And if you need that assistance, come and talk to your supervisor about it. There's also a lot of overlap between certain things. So program assistance, something like room checks and chores, that's something that when you're there that you're in charge of, but equally when night and weekend are there, night and weekend is in charge of, right? So some of this is dependent on like who's covering the house that day. But other things like house meetings, groceries, meal planning, all the cooking and the inventory, that stuff is all in program assistance buckets. So program assistance, if you see a problem arising in one of these categories, please feel empowered to address that and squash it whenever possible with the families. Case manager on the other side, same thing with like goal setting for the families, and that includes all the things, right? Childcare, budgeting, employment, the house hunt, school and benefit enrollment, all those things. As you see problems arising, please squash those things. Just have the conversation with the family and squash it whenever possible. There are some things that are overlaps though. So program assistance and night and weekend, for something like, for example, room checks or chores, we want you to follow those procedures, right? You have multiple conversations, you set a natural consequence. As soon as those things have been done and you bring it to your supervisor, what we are wanting you to identify is, okay, this is now a repeated pattern of behavior and my attempts to address it haven't worked. Then it floats over, you'll see that it floats over here into the case manager and supervisor bucket. So part of what they will be addressing is, this is something, whatever the topic is, but it's something that's been brought up multiple times. We've already addressed it. Case managers and supervisors are now going to address this as a pattern, and probably that will lead to this second category, right, of overlap, which is write-ups and exits. So those are things that are shared really across all of our transitional housing team, but it will just look a little bit different depending on who's doing the addressing. Supervisors are also going to handle things like contract meetings and progress meetings, and then providing the backup to the rest of the staff, right? So the supervisor is here to serve you, right? To be your backup. So call on them when you need them. So those are the things that are the way we've kind of structured the differences. The things that are the same is this middle category, everybody. So if you're on shift, this is something we want you to be paying attention to. Doesn't matter what your role is. If you're on shift, please take care of this. So life skills is a funny one like that, because Sometimes case managers on shift for that night. Sometimes program assistants are on shift for that night. Sometimes night and weekend staff are on shift for that night. So if you're there on a night that life skills is happening, part of what we'd like you to do is make sure everyone's attending. And if they're not, address it. And same thing, if it becomes a pattern, come and tell your supervisor. Same thing for the rest of the category is those bigger themed things, right? So any safety issues, anytime there's conflict in the house, anytime that the resident's bringing a concern to you, any of those things that if they happen while you're on shift, doesn't matter what your role is, please address it. And if you need, follow the same steps. If it's an emergency, call your supervisor, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the things that no matter the shift, we want people to take care of. And the thing that I think will help us overall is to just keep in mind, we're looking for patterns here. We're looking for progress, right? It's not going to be a straight line. Families are going to go up and down as the circumstances in their life changes. So we're just looking for a trajectory towards progress. And if we're seeing that, then that tells me that we're on the right track, right? It's never going to be a fully smooth system, but we hope that the goal for all this is to try to free up some of everybody's like mental energy to focus on the stuff that's in your bucket without feeling this burden to manage what is in everybody else's bucket. Let that be in their bucket. They got it. Any questions about this part?
Natalie, I just have a kind of question or statement. I just because a couple of things have come up, and as far as program assistants also taking every other Friday off, and night and weekend people being around. Can you clarify if there isn't, for example, if there's a need for something at LR or any of the houses, I'm assuming that the night and weekend person or the weekend manager is they can step up and do whatever is necessary. Coins are missing or someone needs coins to wash something that's for the house.
Yeah, totally. I think program assistants and night and weekend, I think actually have quite a bit of overlap, more so than I had room for in this specific chart. So yeah, night and weekend, or whoever's there on Friday, right? Especially Friday, since that's our least covered day. If there's any of that kind of stuff, anytime a family needs anything, right? If they're coming to you even to open a door or whatever, doesn't really matter the level of their concern or the level of their request. If you're there, especially on a Friday, please do try and just take care of it and have that be the end of it. If there's an issue of supplies, maybe is that kind of part of your question, Tanya, as far as
Well, that also comes into play. But I'm assuming if it's something, if it's I'm assuming that they can figure out, is it a necessity or not? If it can wait, it can wait for the program assistant to purchase whatever's needed when they come back. But if it's a necessity, they kind of have to figure out, okay, this is really necessary. I need to step in and purchase whatever is necessary for the house.
Totally. Yeah. And if it's, again, that is something where either, if you're able to go make a purchase and get reimbursed, we would love that. If that's not an option for you, that's something you could call me about and we would work out. For example, for people who don't have credit cards to make the purchase is what I'm thinking. So yeah, if it's crucial, we're not going to get through the weekend without this and I can't get reimbursed, that's something that you could call me about on a Friday. But I totally agree with what you're saying, Tanya. Please do think about, for all these things, no matter what it is you're addressing, we want you to think about, is this an emergency? If it's not an emergency, can I handle it, right? And kind of squash the issue. And if it is an emergency, am I able to figure it out or do I need to call somebody in? And if you need to call somebody in, feel free to call.
Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah. I know we're still figuring out this scheduling thing too. So that I know that's part of it, but same thing. If it's truly an emergency on a Friday, call me first. that's the end of my content. Any other about any of this? Questions, concerns? Does this all feel like in line with how we're thinking about things? Any concerns from anybody?
Can I just mention a kind of issue that I had, and then once I had it, I kind of felt molded. So I kind of am clear where you say that when we're in the home, no matter what our role is, we can say something or we can address something or something like that. Um, and so, I'm just kind of apprehensive about that because the few times that I have, it kind of depending on the house, it kind of hasn't been well received. I was at Villa the other day and Tati was running back and forth, doing her thing. But when I came in the house, I went and did something. I came back out and the TV was on and everybody was in, doing their thing in the living room. And I had just said, I was like, hey guys, make sure, is it okay that you guys, have the TV on? And Mabel set me straight. So in the future, I'm like, well, maybe I shouldn't have just said anything. Maybe I should have just went on now. So I'm kind of wondering, like, I want to use wisdom, and did I do the right thing, or what do I do?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Miss Wendy. I think I would say two things from that example. One is what I'm talking about when we're talking about addressing certain things, I'm talking about specifically times where you are the coverage person. So if
Okay.
maybe I'm misunderstanding that question, but like if Tatiana's there and she's the coverage person, then let her handle that because
Okay.
what I would assume, we want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And so for something like a TV, I would assume that they either talked about it with Tatiana and got it cleared, or it's not that big a deal to Tatiana. And so let's not worry about it. If you're the coverage person, though, and you're the only one there, right? It's your shift to be there, then you'll know more in terms of, did this person talk to me about whatever the issue is? So that's the first thing.
Okay.
The second thing is, I think similar, we talked about this briefly, but in a different context. Like if you are something like a TV issue, to me is not, if it's not causing a problem, then let's not create a problem. If it's a problem in terms of like, it's super late at night and people are trying to sleep, or the volume on this is way too loud and it's disrupting people. If there's a problem that it's causing, then let's address that problem and ask them either turn it off, let's go to bed, or whatever.
Okay.
But if it's the middle of the day, they have the TV on,
Right.
like
It
it's
wasn't
not.
just the TV. I mean, it was complete wild and out going on. So that's the only reason I said anything. Other than that, I would have just really walked out. But all the couch cushions were off. I mean, it was just a heyday. But like you said, yeah, it's
Yeah. So
over.
to me, that means we got to address the actual problem, right? So if it's a chaotic situation and it's not really so much about the TV, to me, it sounds more like parents maybe need to be watching their kids better, If that's the situation, like these kids are in here doing chaos, okay, then let's say, where's mom? Let's come and get mom,
Gotcha. Okay.
like what is the heart of the problem, I think is important, because if we're not clear about why we're asking them to do something, then the way it's often received is this person's just on top of me about every little thing and I can't catch a break, right? So we don't want you to do that. We want you to address it if it's an actual problem that you are identifying that is something that's against the guidelines, right? And it's causing an issue for somebody else. But if it's just like, not that all these things, I'm not trying to say that it doesn't matter. Everything matters, but the thing that matters more to me is the quality of the relationship that the staff have with the residents. And so especially if it's a situation where this is kind of borderline, the TV is not like hurting somebody to have the TV on, I don't know this family that well, or I haven't built up enough of a relationship, then to me, it's not worth a conversation, because I want you guys to have opportunities to build a relationship first and foremost, and only address those things, especially the things that are not like safety critical after the fact. Does that
Okay.
make sense when I'm like how I'm explaining it?
Yes, totally makes sense.
Okay. I think there's a ton of things like that, right? Because there's so much stuff, like this family left this thing here, whatever. There's a million things in a day that we could be addressing. But I do want us to be conscious of, is this a really important thing that I need to address? If it is, then please do. But if it's not that big of a deal, it's not hurting anybody, they're going to like give them the chance to fix it first, you know? And also the like that sort of nitpicking dynamic that we can fall into if we're not careful, that does real harm to our relationships with them. And then when we have to ask them for a real big thing, there's no like relationship trust there, and that's not what we want. So don't stress
Okay, so
yourself.
I just want to go, yeah, I just want to go 2 steps further. It definitely was not nitpicking. When I walked in, the door was barricaded. I didn't know what was happening. I thought maybe they had installed locks, because I know that they have a few runners there, but they had the door barricaded. So I kind of walked in like, oh, oh my God, what's happening here? So that's the only reason why I said something. But they explained in Mabel's words that we haven't put in the appropriate safety precautions. So this is how they are protecting the children. So I understood that after, but yeah, I just kind of walked into something and I was like, what are we doing here? So yeah, I was definitely not going to be nitpicking.
Yeah, I'm not trying to accuse you of that, Miss Wendy. I'm just saying that is the dynamic that we're at risk of. You know, that's part of why we're having this conversation, because we are asking them to do so much. There is no way for them to have every single thing and still allow us to have a good relationship with them in the hopes of getting them housed, you know? So we need to be picking our battles as well.
Makes sense. Thank you.
And I think too, the other thing I'll just end on as we finish up is the tone is the number one thing, right? So you can say anything to anybody if you have the relationship with them and you say it to them right. But if we're coming in hot and we're already like looking for a problem, like even if we're not looking, if that's the perception, right? It's like this person comes in here and they tell me what to do and they never acknowledge when I do anything right, and I can't please them anyway, so why am I going to try? You know, then that leads to, well, then I quit all these things and y'all can kick me out. And that's not the dynamic we want, right? So we have to be the person who's tempering our words and being extra cautious and all those things. We cannot expect the families to do that. We as the service provider have to be the one doing that. Any other questions, thoughts, feedback?
I think you hit it on the money. Natalie, I always say pick your battles, and if it's not harming anyone, that's the prime example on the TV. I see them watching. If it's not too loud, if they're not watching anything inappropriate, yeah, it may not be the TV hours, but hey, it's fine, or as long as the kids are behaving or whatever is happening, then, they know. And then I do tell them, hey, if it gets out of control, I might have to turn off the TV. So they kind of know. And they actually always respect whatever, whatever I tell them. So I never have any kind of problems like that. But I'm also not ever constantly nitpicking at everything either, because I know that they have so many rules that they do possibly get overwhelmed with all the things that they have to be watching.
Yeah. Thanks, Tanya. Yeah, I mean, I think I wonder for you, Miss Wendy, and maybe Mariana, or I know Larika's not here, but she'll be watching it. But I wonder for some of you that are graduates, like I don't know if this is the case or not, but I think certain, especially who graduated quite a long time ago, the rules were very different. I think you guys were held to a certain standard about everything, and so there may be times where you'll just have to kind of assess for yourself, like, is this rubbing against like a certain feeling in me because of how, like, the idea I have of what the program should be, and like, I won't presume to make that assessment for you, but it just makes me wonder if that's a question for you guys to think about, because like we are moving away from that on purpose. You know, this isn't an accident. We've made these choices deliberately to do things the way that we're doing them, and which is why we're asking everyone to follow this. It's not, it hasn't come on a whim or because it makes things like it's just going to give us less of a headache. You know, it's on purpose, it's with intention. And so, so if anybody is having kind of feelings about that, please feel free to talk to me or your supervisor or whatever, because it is deliberate. So anything else from anybody? All right. Thank you guys. Thanks for your attention. I know this was a lot of talking. I appreciate you guys. These like training forms are going to be in the binders that are on every site, the training binders. So if you ever want to refer to them again, that's where they are, but mostly for new staff coming in. And as we kind of implement this, please be in touch with your supervisor as any questions arise or issues arise, and we'll just keep moving in the direction so that ultimately we're one team with one process, with one way of thinking about things, and families can rely on, no matter which side I'm at, I'm going to get treated the same. Thank you guys. I appreciate all your hard work, everything you do for these families every day. We'll see you guys later.
Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, guys.